Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody's well. Thank you so much for sparing some time to come and join us on our webinar this afternoon. Can I just do a check just to make sure everyone can hear and see us okay? So as with all these webinars, there should be a chat facility and you should be able to sort of pose any comments and any questions, but I'll come to that in a second. But if people could just use that just to confirm that you can hear and see us okay.
Yeah, that's been confirmed, Keith. Brilliant,
thank you so much. I always feel it's best to start with that because often I've been speaking to myself and realised that the technology hasn't quite worked. So, thank you so much. So for those that don't know me, my name is Keith Smith. I'm Director of Post-16 Strategy in the Department for Education. My work has really been involving over the last sort of 18 months working on our Post-16 FE reform plans, thinking about the system and our opportunities to do amazing things. And this afternoon we're going to be talking about a really important element of that reform programme around the funding and accountability reforms. But before I go into that in a little bit more detail, I just want to introduce two colleagues that are going to be also presenting to you this afternoon, who are very much working very closely on the work on funding and accountability. So I'll start with Sarah. Sarah, just want to say hello and just introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, Sarah Hollingshead. I'm really on the funding aspects of the work. I've been working in post-16 area for about 5 years and in the department for about 21 years. So love working on education policy. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you, Sarah. Lawrence.
Hi everyone. It's really nice to be here, and I'm Lawrence. I've been working on these funding and accountability reforms with Sarah. I previously worked in the Prime Minister's Implementation Unit, where I was responsible for the skills brief there. So really pleased to continue with that over in DFE.
Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you, Sarah. And as I've said, you'll hear more from those for them a bit later. So I'm going to kick off by just doing a bit of an introduction. I thought before we jump into funding and accountability, we should sort of do a little bit of a reminder of what the reform programme overall is about. So I'm going to speak to that in a couple of minutes, and then we'll have a chance to take a few questions on that. And again, that's just to set the context as a bit of a refresher and to remind people and to ask, really to enable you to ask any questions about where the overall reform programme is going. And then we'll jump straight into then the more detail around the funding and accountability elements of that. As we go through, as I said at the very beginning, please do use the chat function and questions. We're going to be pausing at a couple of points during the next over the next hour or so to be able to take questions. So we've got a team on standby who are going to be looking at the questions that are going to be coming in, any comments, and they'll be putting them to us as we go through the next hour or so. So please do take the opportunity to pose any questions or ask for any clarification that you're interested in. We do these sessions very much to enable you to go away with some useful information and insights. So they are very much about providing you with information so that you're able to look at what we're trying to do and actually get any sort of questions or anything you want to explore or follow up on. So we do really want to leave this hour with any questions or any insights that you've got for you to be sharing them with us, and we'll do our very best to answer those back to you. I should also say, as we go through over the next few minutes, this is about a consultation, a very important consultation. A lot of what we're going to talk about today are about our views and our ideas, about some of the questions we're trying to pose to ourselves. So the consultation is very much as it is a genuine consultation. We really want to hear your views and your opinions. We hope by doing this webinar we will be able to do, as I said, answer any questions you've got, share any insights that we can with you, but really also to try to encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to make a response to the consultation. It really does matter to hear the views of all of you and all of your sort of knowledge and expertise in the system that you're part of. So please do take the time, if you haven't already done so, please do share any responses back with us. Of course, we'll be using this opportunity to take any notes. We'll look at the questions and comments that come through the chat, and of course we'll be using those to reflect as well. So please, if you have got insights, please do share those in the chat with us, and we'll be collecting all those up as well. So that's probably enough, I think, in terms of the way of introductions. So I wanted just to spend a few minutes just summarising the reforms in general, and to really try and set the context for why funding and accountability. So I'm really personally excited about the reform programme, not least because I've worked on it and I've been spending much of my life putting it together, but really also because I think what we're trying to achieve for the reform agenda is actually really look at all of the lessons learned over recent years and all the things that we've tried to develop, and actually try to think about that through what we talk about in terms of the system architecture. So we're trying to think about our reform programme as an end-to-end in terms of what needs to happen. We were really keen that this was about trying to shape the system, support the system, encourage the system to be confident in what it does. We wanted very much to build upon the brilliance and the outstanding, exceptional work that goes on in and around the system, but to actually try to look at that through how can we actually make the lives easier for you in actually critical people and stakeholders in the system, but also really I think just to try to ensure that it was coherent. And I think many of you will know we've been and tried various times to reform elements of the system, but we've never really had an opportunity to really look at the whole system architecture altogether. And that's very much, I think, what we're trying to do through the reform programme as a whole. To do that, we are posing a central question, which is trying to give the confidence of the system to be thinking about quality and to be thinking about the really important job of quality of teaching and learning. There is no system, unless we get fantastic teaching and learning, and so that's really the bedrock, I think, of a lot of our thinking. We're doing that very much by trying to shape the offer, the different qualifications that get studied and get offered. So we've got a huge programme of work on expanding T-levels, on doing qualification reform and development. And critically, all of those are really being done and designed to enable the provision that we fund much more responsive to the needs of the economy and the labour market. And that really brings me on to my second really important fundamental point around really trying to help the system to think about how it services the local labour market, how it services jobs. We know that the brilliance of what the study programmes do in terms of advancing people through academic study, and we're ambitious to make the technical and vocational system as world leading as the academic system. And so that's very much about trying to create the connectivity with jobs. That is about exploring what the role of employers are in that system. And we're doing a lot of work in that, in testing, in essence, local structures to enable your organisations to come together, to develop that sort of local that planning conversation, to develop the infrastructure that's needed, but very much in mind of collaboration, of really bringing the best of what everybody does to the forefront, and actually then trying to look at ways that we can develop that very much in responding to business need. So that business need, making business, jobs, employers, the economy, the labour market, all central to our thinking is really critical, I think, as a founding principle. So it's about quality and about driving the products and the offer. It's about supporting excellence in teaching and learning, which is why we have a huge amount, again, in the teacher support and development space and professional development. It's about thinking about the role of business and employers, and about thinking how do we create structures that work locally. And I wouldn't underline that phrase local. It's really important that this is about local responses, working for local people and local businesses. That's really important. We've tried really hard in doing that to maintain things that already work really well. So we're trying to optimize the apprenticeship model, want to retain that and continue to make that employer-led. But it is important that we think about how we kind of learn from the experiences of delivering apprenticeships in terms of how we develop our wider system reform. And of course, finally, it brings us into the area of funding and accountability, which actually is probably, again, one of the foundations of all of those reform proposals. If we don't think about how we make funding simpler to understand, I think you would all agree we will not optimise any ambitions for system reform. It's really important that we see funding through the lens of supporting the outcomes we want to achieve, not driving them or not providing the wrong incentives for doing so. It's important we think about funding as an enabler. It's an investment. It's a mechanism to invest in the system for you to be able to locally ensure that you're being able to make the right decisions for what provision is needed locally. We want the incentives to be about, as I've said earlier, jobs and the needs locally. We don't want the incentives to be around the incentives of how to maximise a really complicated funding methodology, for example. And of course, for those that have been around the system for as long as I have will know, we've had various attempts to do that. And I think we also need to reflect very hard ourselves on how we kind of learn from that and how to optimise that. And I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment. But of course, we also need to deal with and think about accountability. If we're going to really simplify and streamline funding to really direct that to deliver the reform outcomes that I've been outlining, then it's really important that we explore also the role of accountability in the system. And we do see a world that we can be really ambitious about what the post-16 system does. We can celebrate its brilliance. We can be really proud of what we're doing to support you as organisations, as institutions, to really drive what happens locally. And we can, I hope, develop a much simpler funding mechanism. And as I say, we'll talk about that in a second. But critically, let's also try and make sure that we're doing that in the right way and actually recognising that achievement and think about the accountability. And importantly, where funding can be simpler, because we can actually drive, we can build clearer accountability models in the way we can actually do that together. So that's very much me setting the context. I've about taken my 10 minutes to do that. So that's hopefully giving you some sense and a bit of a reminder. For those that haven't read it, I really would encourage you to read the Skills for Jobs white paper. There's a huge amount of detail and information in there. And critically, I think a huge amount of ambition and opportunity. And finally, before I sort of pass to the team for a few questions, is of course all of this is underpinned by a skills bill. And the importance of, I think, of the skills bill and the white paper taken together is that these are government policy documents. So much of the work we may have been doing before has been really important from a departmental point of view, but this is now a government strategy. And I think one of the exciting things at the moment is we have really, strong political support, really senior levels for what we're doing. I know the Prime Minister himself, our new Secretary of State, and the new ministerial team are very much ambitious for us continuing this work. And of course, the Skills Bill represents an opportunity to really recognise the brilliance of the FE system and to actually put some of that onto a legislative basis. So all of that taken together, I hope will give you huge confidence that we're working on something that really matters. For this conversation, hopefully to get your minds going in relation to the conversation we're going to have in a moment around the funding and accountability, and just to reinforce that this is very much I think a strategy that we really need to work on together. So I'm going to pause there and just open it for any questions. The team that have been looking at that, are there any questions that anybody has sent in before I move on to the detail of the funding and accountability work?
Hi Keith, yeah, we have had something coming through here from Steve Hewitt, and the question is, or the comment is, here's the thing, we can't have a simple streamlined funding system and have a fair system. Complication, which isn't bad, comes when we target funding at the people who need it more. Unless the simplification plan is, here is a pile of money, which judging by the accountability talk, it won't be. It can't be fair and simple. Do you have any comments to that?
Yeah, and thank you. It's a really good question, and I think one that I would certainly say in my time in the system, I've reflected often about complexity and precision, versus sort of simplification and fairness. I personally think this is achievable, in essence, because one of the things that we're going to try to look at here is not confuse the allocation or distribution of money with the earning of the funding. And I think we're very keen to be able to sort of separate those two questions. So as we go through, perhaps this afternoon, we'll talk a bit more about that. But that will be something I'll be really encouraging you to provide your reflections around. So we do want there to be a really clear approach to the way we allocate funding and the way we allocate budgets. I'm going to say a little bit more about this in a moment. But equally, we think we can actually do a huge amount beyond that in terms of the actual funding mechanism itself. And again, I'll be exploring a little bit more of the detail over the next few minutes about how we think we can do that. But it's a really great question. I think I'm being very challenging of myself and our team not to talk ourselves back into complexity. So I think it is a really good challenge, but one I'm hoping we can collectively and together rise to. And finally, I probably would say, as we get into this conversation today, and as we develop this conversation over the coming weeks and months, this won't be the only consultation we do in this area. So it's really important that we've done something around the principles of how we do this, and it's critically important that we reflect back on that, the design elements to a future system, but we continue to keep the open conversation on how we actually then build the detail behind all of that. So I think there's a huge commitment for us to really work together in how we actually ensure we can get proper simplification without huge amounts of unfairness or uncertainties.
That's great, thank you.
Do we have any more questions?
We have a question that's come in from Paul Phillips, asking, will the reforms enable an equal playing field? For example, can we ensure we avoid the combined authority rules versus the ESFA models?
Okay, and thank you for your question, Paul. And again, I think it's a really important point that you flagged there. And I should really, I guess, for the purpose of this conversation, is just to reassure, our work that we're doing here, will not infringe on the important role and delegated authority the combined authorities have. So there's a really important distinction here between what this conversation is about, is how do we develop the architecture for all of the funding that isn't devolved. It's really important that we continue to respect the role of mayors and combined authorities in their with their devolved powers. And so it's really important that the way that they actually continue to make decisions obviously is a really important question for them. But of course, we are working, and trying to work very closely with them, with the combined authorities and the officials in the combined authorities to be able to, work openly and collaboratively about the sorts of things we're developing and designing in relation to the funding that we've actually got. But it's a really important point, I think, just to flag that. And again, thank you so much for raising that. If that's the last question, I propose we move on, if that's okay, because I think that's probably just a bit of setting the scene. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So what I want to do now, before I hand over to Lawrence, is I wanted to spend a few minutes just really talking through the context really about what we're actually, the headlines of what we're really consulting on. And so at the headline level, it is very much around proposing to think about how we redesign the funding and accountability system. So it does encourage and focus around good outcomes. I mentioned at the very beginning of this webinar that one of the really important principles we're trying to develop here is to actually free funding from complexity, but critically also to make it much more focused around driving the outcomes we want to see from the system. I think you could potentially characterize the current system as very input driven, which adds to the level of bureaucracy that we have and the complexity that we have. We're really interested in your views around the balance between really an input system versus an outcome system, so that we actually think about, let's say, the balance of trade-offs between the two things. But what's really important, I think, in terms of what we're trying to set up, is that we've got 3 areas in particular that we're trying to sort of develop some thinking about. So the first really is around how we support providers to focus on those outcomes, and how do we really support the work that you do in supporting students to get into good jobs. So to try to do some of this, we're proposing a few things. So the first is a new accountability agreement. So if we think about a world which is free from a lot of the complexity that we've got, we do feel it's important that for there to be clear accountability and public accountability for what institutions are then doing with the funding. And we feel that actually it's really important that if we're able to remove some of the complex rules and regulations that go around the system, that actually can we be much clearer about what the outcomes we're expecting or trying to get from the funding and the investment that's going through. So we're testing this principle of an accountability agreement, thinking about how to actually give freedom back, particularly to colleges and institutions. I'll talk about independent providers in a second. And to think about how they're able to actually talk much more strategically and much clearer about the outcomes they're trying to drive as an incentive, I guess, for ensuring that they can then make decisions locally about the curriculum and about the teaching and learning that they actually do. And that's going to be quite a big shift in itself, away from potentially decisions that you're taking on how to earn funding through a complex formula. And so we'll talk about that in a second. So that in essence is what we're trying to capture with the accountability agreement. And of course, I'm really interested in your views on how we really make this an agreement which is very clearly put together by boards, by corporations, by governing bodies. So there's a really important question here about whether an accountability agreement type model works, what we'd want to see in it, and importantly how we actually get that put together. But again, I know Lawrence and Sarah will be talking a bit more about this a bit later. The second is thinking really about how we develop and measure success. So if we're going to have a much simpler system, then how do we measure that success? And we've proposed the idea of a simpler performance dashboard, which includes measures around the outcomes that we're particularly interested in doing. As I said at the very beginning, there's going to be a huge amount of work we're going to need to do together on developing what goes in the dashboard. We've set out some early ideas on that, but again, I'll let the team talk about that again in a second. That's another important element, I think, of what we've not quite got right in previous attempts to simplify funding. We often haven't been clear about accountability and the way we support accountability, and we haven't always been really clear about how we actually measure success from that simplification and from that work. And so that, I think, gives us an opportunity to think about collectively how we measure that success. But critically, I would offer at this point, it's really important though that we don't see that as so narrow. It doesn't give actually the institutions locally an opportunity to make sure it's putting on the right provision. Because as I said at the very beginning, the whole idea of this work is to actually support the system to make, to put the provision on which is supporting, local people, local employers, local jobs. And so it's really important that we, embrace that and don't lose sight of that principle. And thirdly, importantly, the role of Ofsted as the sector's inspectorate in this area, really thinking about what their role will be in inspection. You will know how important inspection is, how critical, how important you take that and the work on how you're developing, good quality teaching and learning. So it's really important that we think about, and we've posed a few questions for you on what you think that role of Ofsted should be. So all of that is really about how can we tilt the system to focus much more on the outcomes and the students we're trying to support. The second area is around is how we actually make better a system for support and intervention. We know from time to time institutions require extra support. We're really interested in thinking about how we strengthen the FE Commissioner's role in doing that. We think the FE Commissioner should be about improvement as well as intervention. We think it's really important that the capacity of the FE Commissioner and their team actually offer advice and support and encouragement for those that are good to be great, and indeed have a role of helping disseminate great practice across the system and the sector as a whole. So a real kind of important opportunity for us here to think about, can we broaden the role of the FE Commissioner? Can we make them much more of a sector asset in terms of driving improvement and support, and not just being simply a tool for intervention? And that's, again, some really important questions for us to explore together. Underpinning that, the idea of a single improvement plan. And again, this will be really about trying to bring together the different conversations and the different elements and processes that can happen sometimes around improvement. We want to try and make this easier for you. So we're going to talk a lot about funding in a moment, but really importantly, if we're going to simplify funding, can we also simplify how we actually go about improvement? Because improvement links so closely to that accountability question. So that's, again, another area we'll be really interested to explore with you in a bit more detail. And thirdly, in this area is around improving data quality. I think we've got a lot more to do as part of the reform programme overall in terms of our data strategy, and that's what we're thinking we're doing at the moment. But in this particular context, it's about trying to think about the burden that we're placing on you as providers and institutions through the student data collection and the financial reporting. Again, we don't want to sort of simplify one element of the funding mechanism only to have complexity elsewhere, and for therefore us not necessarily realising the whole structural benefit of simplification. Again, this is an area which we wanted to include. We haven't always thought about this in previous attempts to simplify a system, and that's why I said at the beginning, this is about system-wide simplification and structural reform. So it's really important that we include that. And of course, if there are areas that you feel we're missing or we should be adding, that's exactly the type of thing we'd like to see back through the consultation. And then thirdly, I would just say around the mechanisms of funding themselves. So we've talked about in the consultation introducing a single skills fund. That I think is always desirable. We've had various, again, I say, attempts at that before. I think what's different this time is that I think we've got a real huge opportunity to do that consolidation, because we're doing it alongside all these other areas for simplification as well. And it's not simply the creation of a single skills fund, and we're going to retain the complexity underpinning all of that. We're not going to just leave that in place. We're going to try and do all of that together. So that's really important. The second is around, again, this idea of allocating funding and how we actually do that, and how we do that in a really fair, open way. But critically, we feel distribution of funding is a mechanism that should not be confused with the earning of funding. And I think we've said a lot about, we'll say a little bit more about, actually, if we can simplify the earning of funding, then we can potentially move to a more lagged model. We can potentially move to a more multi-year dimension. But again, I won't say too much because the team are going to say a bit more about that, as I said, after me. And finally, I think this is a really important point about certainty. I think one of the characteristics we see often in the funding system at the moment is real uncertainty with institutions about exactly how much of the funding they think they're going to be able to earn, how much they feel they're going to be able to retain, worries about sort of audit approaches and reconciliation. Those can be really difficult judgments and issues. And we saw a lot of challenges for us in the system through COVID and the COVID disruption and the uncertainty that was creating. And so we directly want to address that and think about that again in our structural thinking of what does a really world-class funding mechanism look like that really encourages institutions, I say, to play the role we're looking for. So that in essence is a summary, I think, of what we're trying to do at a very high level design. I would just underline that, and the final thing I will say on this is I would just underline all of that by a really important point about this is all about putting you as institutions more in the sort of the confidence, giving you the confidence and put you in the driving seat to be able to make sure funding can be utilised for the benefits of what's needed locally. Okay, and it's about us really fundamentally exploring how we can actually give much more empowerment to you as organisations, institutions to do that, versus encouraging and incentivising you through complex funding mechanisms and models. And then finally, we need to also think about, really importantly, the role of independent training providers. We think it's really important that we think about how we fund independent training providers. You are very much sometimes different types of organisations to colleges. So we've got some particular questions specifically about the independent sector, and critically how we should fund institutions in that space. So it's really important that we again open up to the idea that we've actually got to think about the appropriateness of funding for the entire system, and that we're not simply developing it for one part of the system at the expense of the other. So it's really important that we think about both sides of those things and think about appropriate funding mechanisms that can be both simple and clear, driving and encouraging the right outcomes and the right incentives. So I think that's everything for me. I think I'm going to hand over to Lawrence, I think, at this stage. Lawrence, over to you. And I think you're going to say on accountability.
Great, thanks very much, Keith. And if we could flick on to the next slide as well, that would be great. So before I get into this slide, I just wanted to firstly repeat, I think, a really important message that came from Keith's introduction on how these are all ideas that we're putting forward in a consultation to test with you and to get feedback on. And they're not things that we are wedded to or feel in any way that are sort of set in stone. And we've been, over the last couple of months and weeks, well, right from the start of January, really speaking to people like yourselves about the proposals and sort of refining and iterating them as we go. But we've obviously got this consultation that's live, closing on the 7th of October, and we'll be looking to your responses there really carefully to to adapt if needed the proposals we put forward. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing I wanted to say is that when we started with this work in earnest in January, we were sort of struck by the scale of the system that we were trying to grapple with and design a future for. And we started small by thinking about how could these proposals work for FE colleges in the first instance. But we think that in a sort of fair and proportionate way, they can apply to all types of providers. But again, we're really keen on your thoughts on that very question, and we've got a question and a section in the consultation asking for your views on how this should work. So as we're talking through, I think it'd be great if you could keep in the sort of back of your mind that kind of question, because I'm really interested in your thoughts on that particularly as well, alongside a whole host of other things. Okay, so I'll just say a bit more about some of the system components that Keith was alluding to a minute ago, and just to repeat something else that he said, the reason that we are proposing these new components in the consultation is because we would like to encourage the sector to focus more on the outcomes that they're delivering for young people and adults, things like getting their students into good jobs, things that the taxpayer is really interested in, and so these new components are designed to try and do that. And we're therefore not only interested in your views on how we could operationalize those components, but indeed the principle of whether you think that they will achieve that objective. And the first one to talk about is the accountability agreements. And so what do we mean by that? And what's the thinking here? So we think we propose that they do two things. So firstly, we heard a lot of times when we were speaking to people that they felt like government wasn't particularly clear on its priorities. And so the first thing we thought we would use this agreement for is to articulate, to describe what those national priorities are, that are priorities, skills priorities across the country, whether you're in Cambridgeshire or Cumbria. They're important, irrespective of location. And then the second thing we thought we could use this accountability agreement for is to describe the processes we expect all good providers to have in place around audit, around good governance. And we know that lots of that information is out there, but I think it's fair to say that it's in lots of desperate places. And the idea here is to try and sort of bring that together, but also, as we're doing that, to look to see where we can sort of streamline and consolidate and make those expectations cleaner and easier to understand. So that's the upfront bit. And then the second part of this agreement is where we're inviting providers to describe key areas that they want to focus on over the course of the time that they're receiving their funding. And I think there's a real job to synthesize the information that we as a central government have articulated in the upfront bit of the plan, but also to reflect the local priorities that might be included in a local skills improvement plan, or the expectations that a mayoral combined authority is setting for money that it is providing. And we're trying to avoid a bureaucracy here. We're trying to focus on sort of key areas of change, and we'd expect that we know that many colleges do this already, and so there won't be any change here for the vast majority. We'd also expect that college leaders will want to do this with reference to better data that Keith alluded to earlier. So that's the idea here, and we would like to give this agreement some elevated status, and the way we're proposing to do that in the consultation is to make this agreement formally between Secretary of State and the leadership and governance of a college, and there would be some sort of public accountability for this document as well, because it would be on a gov.uk website potentially. So really interested in people's responses to the consultation on that proposition. And then moving on, we've got this other key proposal around a new performance dashboard. The objective here was similar, to be more outcome focused. And so we're trying to make sure that this dashboard has as many outcome based measures as possible, though some output measures might be needed to balance the sort of timeliness of when data is available. The objective here is also to try and sort of distill down, similarly to the accountability agreement, for us to be much clearer on what excellence looks like in a small number of measures. And with trying to do that, with trying to sort of be clear on what those measures are, we will need to make some sort of trade-offs on what we prioritize and what we care about more. And I think we'll need to come to you again with a proposition to test on exactly what that composition looks like. I think the value of the dashboard is mainly for the leadership of providers to refer to and to benchmark their performance together against other similar providers. I think that we're not sort of blind to the challenge that a college in one part of the country is in a very different labour market to one, in another part of the country. And so one of the key things here for us is to make sure that these measures are fair and comparable. That's really important. And likewise, we put forward a proposal to introduce a new skills measure, an outcome-based skills measure that Ofsted might want to take into account when it's planning some risk-based inspections that it does. And again, the key thing there is that this measure treats providers fairly based on not only the local labour market context that they're operating in, but also based on the type of students that they have. Not two providers. Providers aren't all the same. That's the simple but key point there. And then finally, on the role of Ofsted. So we've got a section in our consultation where we're really interested in your views on two. It's on how we can maximise the value that Ofsted provides through its inspections of the quality of teaching and learning, to play a role in inspecting on how well providers are meeting the needs of their local economy. And we're working with Ofsted at the moment to consider how that in principle might work. I think that this is something new for them, and we're really adamant that if we did something like this, then quality and the robustness of the inspection is sort of tantamount. And I think that proposal is sort of heavily caveated. It's subject to this type of inspection being possible to do well. But at the moment, we're just consulting on the principle, if you like, of doing this. So if we could just go on to the next slide, I'd like to talk a bit as well about the proposals that we have around support and intervention. Great. So we have a big opportunity through these reforms to support providers more effectively in how they are meeting the needs of local employers, meeting the needs of their students. And what we have proposed to do in the consultation is to develop a system that protects and reinforces the autonomy of providers, and provide support on their terms when they need it. And that's the point of the left-hand side of this diagram, where you'll see that the box on government is right at the bottom, and that's the sort of the pillar of, or the foundation of support. But the real sort of improvement is made by individual colleges, the leadership, the governance, making day-to-day decisions on who they recruit, who they promote, the mix of their provision, what kind of employers they work with, how they do that effectively. All of those things are much more influential than anything that goes on here in Whitehall. And on the right-hand side, that's a description of what we propose would happen in the very small number of cases when, usually as the result of an Ofsted inspection, there is a conclusion that the college or the provider is failing in its delivery. so what do we do in that situation? And the principles that we were working to when we were thinking about this question were to be really clear on and transparent on what the steps are in that process, and to be really clear on who the actor is who supports the provider to improve. And we felt like, and we heard this in feedback when we spoke to colleges, that at the moment there are so many different bodies asking for different bits of information, whether that's Ofsted, the OFS, mayoral combined authorities, the FE Commissioner, the wider Education and Schools Funding Agency. And so one of our key proposals here is to empower the FE Commissioner to take the lead on a situation where a college or a provider is in formal intervention. And how we would propose that works is that the FE Commissioner, following an Ofsted inspection, does an assessment, and that's to translate the inspection into tangible actions, and then works on a single improvement plan that Keith mentioned with the college to agree a process for improvement, and brings together the voice of all of those other bodies I mentioned. And finally, we are also legislating at the moment to give Secretary of State some new powers as a last resort. We really hope that these never need to be used, but they will be in the system as a last resort. Though I would expect that there are sort of many iterations or more than one potentially iteration of a single improvement plan, because change doesn't happen overnight before that would be considered. Okay, I'll pause there, and I'll take some questions. I think Zara's going to man the chat.
There's been so many good questions coming in. It's hard for Lawrence to look and speak, and some of the questions are really good ones. We start thinking about the next level of detail, so we won't get through them all, but keep them coming because it's giving us good food for thought. And I can see lots of you already thinking down to that next level of detail. So I've got two that I picked up for now. One I think Keith you might want to answer, and one for Lawrence. One of the questions that's come out a few times is about how agreeing local skills priorities, how will that work in practice when there's different geographies that colleges and other providers work to. Some providers obviously are national, obviously we all want some national skills priorities, not just local. So maybe Keith, you could just take that one. And then the second one I thought would be good to sort of muse on would be around a skills measure. Obviously jobs are not the only outcome. Sometimes people progressing onto them further learning, which is obviously a good thing, and how that skills measure can reflect the local circumstances in different areas. I've also seen there's loads of funding ones, so I'll try and pick them up when I do my stints as well. Keith, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Yeah, thanks for the question. I was actually just thinking myself that I'm sure lots of people are eager to get into funding, but actually it's really important we start with accountability in the system overall, because this is what sets the context for the funding conversation in a second. I think it's really important here. So I think the accountability agreement we're proposing is really the place where institution will capture what you do as an organisation. Okay, so your national specialisms, the things that you do in different parts of the country, that's the place to be able to think about you as the organisation as a whole. What we're trying to do then through the sort of the LSIP, the local planning model, is again something it's not going to be. It's the idea of that is not to articulate course by course, qualification by qualification, what everyone's delivering. The idea of that is to actually be an expression of what does the area collectively need to do more of in order to be able to organise and tilt provision in a particular direction. So the accountability agreement absolutely will be what we want to try to actually understand for the institution as a whole, because we absolutely understand, for example, land-based colleges are a great example here, where they'll be actually still providing agricultural type provision and that's clearly a national specialism in a lot of what they do. So the accountability agreement is designed to do that. The LTIPs and the local planning is very much about the role that an organisation plays in a local area, and to be part of that conversation about, as I said, those important changes that might need to be seen. So it's really important that when we think about this and you visualise the proposals, to think about it in those two different ways.
So, thanks, Keith. And I'll just come in on the question about the skills measure, and I guess it's sort of question that's pertinent to the dashboard as a whole, which is about how we balance the needs of different learners and recognise that there's more to life than getting a job. We're like grappling with that question right this minute. Actually, before this, I was speaking to some academics on this very question, and I think that what we need to do is to make sure that we reflect firstly priority groups in the dashboard. So that's something that we want to look at in this next phase, and as well consider how we balance the ambition that ministers have to focus these reforms on progression into work with other things like higher levels of learning, further learning, being able to live an independent life, those kinds of things as well.
I think quite around funding, quite a few around different sorts of providers that I think I'll also pick up in the funding section as well. Keith, would you like to move on to funding? I'm keen we have enough time to do justice.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's dealt with most of the immediate questions, so why don't we move on to your section on funding, which I guess is what people are really also keen to hear about.
Thank you. If you go on to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. So just think starting with the sort of recapping some of the sort of the main issues that we heard whilst doing the white paper and work before that from you and others about what the issues that these reforms are trying to address. I think it's important to hold them in our minds as we talk about these sort of proposals. The first one is obviously around the complexity of funding. I think it's important to recognise why that's come about. The adult education system that involves choices around who gets funded and what gets funded in a way that doesn't really apply in other aspects of education, particularly up to 18, where education is more universal. And I think successive governments have tried to answer those questions: what are we funding, and who are we funding in different ways, and that's led to a lot of the complexity that is in the system now. I think we should recognise that ministers will always want to be able to influence those sort of decisions, whilst recognising that the white paper is about trying to get more autonomy to local areas and providers to make those decisions and then hold them to account for the sort of the outcomes that they deliver. So there is that balancing line we've tried to tread between having ability for ministers to ultimately accountable to influence things whilst simplifying the system. That message obviously came across loud and clear, and is a big thread, as Keith says in the white paper. The second sort of issue we want to address is a sort of around the predictability of funding. We don't have a multi-year regime. We do want to move as far as we can to that, and I'll come on to that later on. In the current system, with the sort of initial allocation and reconciliation, can make it very difficult to know what's the budget likely to be going throughout the year, delivering provision without actually knowing what the final budget will be, and that's different to how the schools and 16 to 19 system work. And we want to support you in moving to a system where you can look longer term ahead. What are the skills needs, what are the needs of the learners in my area, and how can I meet them best and plan provision sort of strategically? And we know the current system makes that difficult. And the third one was mentioned as of course around the volume and the level of funding. The consultation is all about how do we deliver whatever funding we've got, and obviously the questions around quantum and funding levels for the spending review, but obviously we're very alive to them, and where there are constraints around the quantum and the funding rate, that's where a lot of the sort of issues around sort of complexity do come in. So they're sort of the three sort of issues that we're keeping in our mind as we try to sort of design these proposals. So our brief was to come up with a much more simpler funding system that supported the sort of autonomous nature of colleges and other providers, giving them the sort of the autonomy to meet skills needs and be held accountable for it, as Lawrence has described. And we want to incentivise the sort of provision that will lead more onto progression and good jobs. We're very mindful it is a taxpayer resource, and we want to make sure there's good value for money for that investment. So at the heart of our process is to try and create a single skills fund. This would capture some of the key government grants that goes out in support of adult skills. We're focusing on adults because we think that's the area that has all the complexity, and that's the area that we've heard most about that needs to change and to meet this sort of the white paper agenda. 16 to 19, I mean, do feed in your thoughts on it, but generally we hear that's a more easily understood, predictable system that follows the universal nature of that phase. We think that single skills fund will complement the other routes that in FE. There's a 16 system that I mentioned. There's loan funding, obviously it's the individual taking out the loan that sort of drives that system. And then there's the apprenticeship funding, whereby the resources are really with apprenticeships employers for them to sort of steer the provision that's needed. So the skills fund will be the sort of the core government grant support for adult skills. We want it to be able to be used for broad purposes. We don't want it to have lots of ring fences or bits kept for different things. We want you to be able to use it to support the skills provision across the piece. We're keen to get lots of views on how this can work best. So I'll go through the areas that we want that the conduct talks about, and that we'll then be keen to sort of get thoughts on through the consultation responses. First thing to say is that a big part of it will be funding the qualifications. We're doing the various stages for qualifications review underway at the moment. So a significant chunk of the skills fund will be funding learners who are doing qualifications. But we know that in many cases a non-qualification route is more can be more useful, more relevant. So we've got some questions in the consultation about how can we fund that sort of non-qualification provision in a better way going forward that gives confidence around the quality of it, but also that allows providers to sort of more meet emerging needs more flexibly. So we're looking forward to getting responses on that part in particular. Within the skills fund, we're seeing that as being the fund, as I say, that will support adult skills. It flows out through two main routes. Part of it is devolved. So the first step in ARSL calculations is to set the share of funding for each MCA, and then there was at the same time a residual share for the non-devolved learners. Currently that's done on the activity that was in place in 2017. That can't be the method going forward forever. So the consultation is seeking views on whether we should move to a needs-based system. We've got a pot of money, we have to break it up. Can we break it up with reference to the relative need of each of those areas? How big are they? What's the deprivation levels? What's the level of qualifications in the adult population? What's the economic need? So really the conduct's asking your views on, is that a better way to divide up that cake? And what, if so, what sort of factors do you think would be most relevant? Open to other suggestions on how to do that, but a needs-based system is used in lots of areas of public sector funding. Obviously, there would be any move going to have distribution implications, and we're very mindful of that. So the conduct talked about, we need to sort of make sure we can bring this in a manageable way. Then we want to, and obviously in MCA areas, it's then a devolved budget. They will then decide how to fund the providers in their areas. In a non-devolved pot, at the moment, ESFA fund providers. Some of it's done through procurement. Goes out to a range of providers who can bid for that. Some colleges bid for that, as well as some ITPs and the providers. And some of it's funded out through grants. And we envisage that coming on. I'll come back to sort of the ITP and other providers angle towards the end. So we've thought long and hard, how can we fund providers in that area? It may be in due course more areas take on a devolved deal, in which case let's find they shift to that sort of first system. But in a devolved area, an undevolved area, how can we best fund it? And the conduct did talk through a few of options that we've been thinking of, but we think on balance the best way is to continue with a learner-based approach. So a provider gets funding for the learners that turn up. But one of the things in particular we will welcome views and thoughts on. What we want to do is to move to a simpler set of funding rates. I'm sure lots of you are familiar with the single activity matrix, but the way the banding of the size of the course works means there's some quite uneven funding rates within that, and we think we can move to a simpler set of funding rates that can take into account the size of the course in a simpler sort of pro rata way, and then that critically can take into account the value of the course as well as the cost. I mean, there is no such thing as costs in a way. You can put on a course for different costs depending on how you sort of resource it, but we're conscious that some courses do typically cost a lot more. So there's already been some work underway, which I know some people you might be familiar with, to sort of look at the relative cost of courses that's been looked at, been led by the 16 to 19 teams and research there. So we want to build on that and try and use that information together with information about value to set some simpler funding rates that can provide that sort of incentive to steer provision towards and support providers to move to sort of higher value provision. Another chunk of this is around trying to streamline additional needs. That's what I call funding for additional needs. So the current system has funding for disadvantage. It also has funding for learner and learning support that can be claimed for. And I think there's one of the points earlier on about the sort of added complexity and administration around FE colleges compared to HE. And I think part of the reason is that there are these claim-based aspects in the funding system. In schools, for example, we just fund for prior attainment deprivation, and the school then gets on with it. We don't then check up on what they spent that particular bit of money for. So the conduct is seeking views on, is it a good idea to move away from that claims-based system to a simplified single source of funding to support learners with additional needs, and what could that be based on? Obviously, like everything, so much more work to do on the detail, but this is our first step, trying to seek views. Are we on the right sort of path with that work? And then across the piece, again, changing anything in the funding world does create distributional impacts, and we'll be very mindful how that is then taken forward. But obviously, providers in this area are much more able to shift what they're doing to respond to that sort of changing funding regime. One of the things we want to do is look at how the funding is allocated in terms of the current system of allocating it and then reconciling it. We proposed in the consultation moving to a lagged system. That's how schools and 16 to 19 works. Obviously, they are easier sectors to do that with more predictable learners. And for us, it's really weighing up the benefits of a lagged system is that you have the predictability. You can plan for the next academic year in certainty, knowing the funding you get. The flip side is that it's not as responsive. If you then take on more learners in one area, the funding won't follow through till later. And there's a real judgment weighing up of what's better. Our view has been, from what we've been hearing, is that the predictability, most providers of big institutions, is more important. But obviously, it's one of the key things. As many things we want to sort of seek your views on through the consultation. We do recognise that if there is a lag system, and there are areas, particularly that ministers want to grow areas like they have done with the level 3 offer, a lag system wouldn't work for that. So we've sort of set out thoughts around how a sort of upfront funding mechanism could work alongside that. So whereby if there is something that we want to sort of see growing, we want to fund in a more sort of live time, we can do that through a sort of separate mechanism. So again, that's another thing that would be good to sort of get thoughts on. I've touched on multi-year before. I mean, this is another one where it's a trade-off of giving certainty and predictability of a multi-year period, but keeping the funding responsive to what is going on. And again, it's a trade-off between that. But what we would like to do is try and give a much clearer funding horizon, so people are clear over the next 3 years. This is how the funding system will work. This is as far as what will be based on. We don't think we'll ever be in a position to guarantee sort of funding rates for 3 years at a trot because of the unknown about how many learners will materialise, but as much, which we're aiming for a system that will give you as much predictability over the regime and the sorts of relativities between the different funding aspects. And we hope that would make quite a difference to the current system. If there are, again, areas where particular bits really make it hard to plan more than 1 year at a time, then that's another thing we'd welcome thoughts on. I think it'd be hard for us to ever do things outside of spending review cycle. I mean, you should keep asking for it if that's important, but that's just the realities of sort of government cycles at the moment. We've also got a section on sort of eligibility questions. Lots of the funding rules relate to who's eligible to receive funding, around age, levels of prior qualifications, ability to pay, all sensible things. But equally, we're aware that then does sort of narrow the flexibility around how funding can be earned, and with the new sort of need of people to retrain more across their lives, that's also raises questions there. And this is quite a really an area we need more thinking on at the moment, to get people's views on how do those eligibility sort of restraints affect how you can meet the needs of sort of employers and learners in the areas that you serve, and so we can sort of take that away and think. Finally, so we can get onto the sort of non-grant funded providers. So lots of what I've talked about will be the way that we will fund providers that get funded through grants. We do procure, provision and direct as well, and what the consultation seeks views on is how is that working. We think that it brings in quite a bit of complexity where people are being grant funded and funded through procurement for the same things. We'd like to there's been more efficiencies with locally, so rather than lots of providers trying to fund the same thing, that there's an ability for colleges that if they or other grant funded providers, if there is another provider who can do something better, that they can commission that provision on, but done well. We think that the department should be clearer where it's going to procure provision. So it's in areas where there's perhaps not the capability or capacity existing now. But again, very open things that we want to sort of seek views on. And where the department does procure, how does that work? How could that be done better? I think I've reached the end of my list. I'm sure there are things in the questions that I've missed, but
thanks, Sarah. That's brilliant, and thank you to you and Lawrence for taking everybody through that. Just a few points to reinforce before we move into questions. We've very helpfully put the link to the consultation in the chat. So as I said at the beginning, if you haven't a chance to read it yet, please do take the time. I think hopefully what you've heard this afternoon gives you a sense of some really big important questions that we're posing together, and we really need your advice and your responses to all of the questions that that we've been sort of posing this afternoon. Just one final thought for me, just on that issue of funding mechanisms. I think one of my personal reflections is, we do too much procurement. We have a huge amount of complexity in the system for people for competing and bidding for funds, and actually we are very keen that if we can introduce a simpler system like this, that can get us much more clearer on the outcomes and the success we're trying to achieve, that actually we should have confidence in using that funding mechanism with the institutions that we're actually funding. And quite, as Sarah says, there's some really important questions here on the funding of independent training providers, as commercial organisations, and so it's really important that we do think about those two questions together. Okay, in terms of questions, I think we've got probably about 10-15 minutes left, I think, in the time that people maybe put aside, but conscious we're getting a bit late in the day. But it is important that we spend maybe the next sort of 10 minutes or so on any questions. And of course, this is an opportunity also for you to just share anything or any questions you think we haven't covered that you'd like us to also talk about. So I guess the floor is yours now for the next few minutes. I don't know who can see the questions and who's going to throw them, who's going to quickly take us through that.
Heath, I'll start with two for Zara on funding. They came up while Zara was talking, and the first one I thought was a really interesting one, which was about funding rules and our ambition to simplify there. And the question was about how we manage taking out rules with creating more sort of grey areas and uncertainty. So that was the first one. And then the second question that came up was about UK SPF, because of course the system that Zara was describing is about adult funding. So where does UK SPF fit in? Zara, do you want to start with those?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. So I'll say UK SPF first. I mean, there's still, I think, quite a lot of decisions still be made about UK SPF. It's seen as a fund that will be across the whole of the union, not just an England only source. And I think what we need to ensure is that we're clear about the distinction between what that's resourcing and what our sort of new skills fund is resourcing, because we are aware that there's been issues before around sort of overlap between the AB and ESF, but a lot more work still to be done and decisions still to be made on that politically around how UK SPF will work. But we take the view that the point that it's the potential for overlap, and we're very mindful to that one. On the rules, I think it's a good point, isn't it? You know, I don't want to be driven by something that it must get down to 50 pages from the current set. And I think we need to balance up the fact that ministers will always want to be able to give some direction to where funding is used. What I'd like to get to is where it's clearer around who gets funding, not a rule around what you can do with the funding that you've got. I mean, currently, once the provider gets their 16 to 19 funding, they're out funding their AEB funding. There is no restraint to them having to spend within those pots. It's just, I think the AEB is so complex around earnings that sort of gets lost. So I think with this, as we get to that next level of detail, we'll want to test and check and work carefully with providers and representatives just to sort of check we're not going to bring in something that might look better on paper but is actually worse. So a long way to go on that one. I've also seen one on the sort of community learning that I thought it's good to pick up. I mean, what we want the skills fund to do is to be a single vehicle that funds everything. Some of that will be qualifications, and some of it will be non-qualification provisions, such as what community learning does now. This will go to a range of providers, grant funded providers, and there will be some procurement still, but in the where we think there's that missing sort of capacity and capability. So there is definitely a need to carry on doing the sorts of things that community learning currently does, particularly reaching the needs of those furthest from the labour market and so on. Some of that is where the UK SPF is likely to get to that space. So provision for that, I'm sure, will be there in the new landscape. Quite how it works is obviously what we're going to need to work through this next in this next level of detail. But it's definitely what we want, the provision that helps get people on the journey towards getting upskilled and getting ultimately into good jobs. That early steps has to be there. There's a lot of people who aren't anywhere near ready to take up a level 3 yet, or even level 2. So we need to have that early level provision in there, and it will be a part of the skills fund.
And I think it's fair to say so, isn't it, that the principle here is we want pretty much all of the skills fund to be consolidated into our new skills fund, so that we don't have separate sort of mechanisms for funding, unless the consultation we decide and determine there needs to be. But then critically important that once that's agreed, that that it's other than for apprenticeships, it's all unring fenced. Sorry, there's no ring fence in there, so it's all unring fenced. So that provides a really important, I think, opportunity for institutions to have much more operational sort of autonomy and capability to be able to make judgments between the type of provision that they need to put on for a particular purpose with the outcomes we're trying to drive. And I think it's really important that when we think about that of course doesn't mean that we are automatically going to just stop funding things. What government chooses to fund will be a matter for them through sort of fiscal events and through the fiscal cycle. So I think for this exercise, very much see it as everything that you're receiving at the moment, try to visualize that through a single mechanism, but just tell us where you feel that may not be possible. And we'd be really interested to hear that, as the reasons that Sarah has said.
I put a few more in that helpful time to scan. Just one I want to acknowledge, not have an answer to. I recognise the point around borders for providers that are on the borders of MCA areas. I mean, it's an issue that we're very alert to. I think it's hard to given that there are devolved deals and those combined areas do have responsibility for commissioning funding, I think it's hard to see us removing that as being an issue. I think there's obviously things we can think about. How can we make it work? How can we make it work best for those providers? So no answer, but definitely noted that point.
Sorry, one point on that. I think you're right to say, you know, this model's absolutely got to respect the role of the devolved areas and the mayors. But I don't see this system making that any more difficult or harder. I think what I would say is the system that we're developing here, if anything, should make that simpler, in the sense that we hope that the benefits of simpler funding and accountability will make it much easier for you as an organisation to think about what you're doing in a particular locality, because you're thinking about where best to make those funding decisions. And I know that's not always easy with some of the constraints around some of the funding mechanisms at the moment. So I think it is important that we think about, you know, respecting that boundary. Our hope would be this proposal would not make that any worse, but indeed hopefully make that much easier. But again, we'd be really keen to hear your views on that in any responses.
It's a couple more I'll pick up. So it's about the need for capital funding. I think we're very alert to the need. If you want to change your mix of provision significantly, it's hard to do that. You need to create the investments that allow you to put on new provision. I think there's some earlier comments around sort of demand-led points, and obviously the demand side aspects of the white paper are really important. How do we ensure sort of learners know the employment prospects of different courses that they go on? So that is an important consideration. I mean, we do currently have a strategic development fund, which is like a pilot fund to sort of test how can additional resources help providers achieve a change that's needed in the area. And similarly, there's the Higher Technical Qualification Growth Fund. So we're certainly mindful that needs to be part of the equation. Obviously, that's more of a spending review issue. And on around sort of in-year growth, I mean, it is difficult. If you have a fixed pot of money, which is how government funding works, because the department gets a fixed quantum from Treasury and spending reviews. If we hold money back through in-year growth, that means we have less to hand out at the start of the year to providers. So again, it's one of those areas that's trade-off. Is it better to hand out less money and be able to give a bit more out for the areas that grow? Or is it better to get the funding out the door in the first place? I mean, these are all things that are trade-offs that it's good to get thoughts on.
Very good. Just conscious of time. With these conversations, time always flies by quicker than you think. But I hope for everybody online, that's been a really great session. As I said, this is the start of many conversations. Sarah and Lawrence, are there any other final questions from anyone you want to just address before we perhaps start to wrap up?
I think we will have a good look. It's hard to get through all of them, but we'll have a good look at all of them. Some I can see more relevant in other areas that we'll pass as it's the ones on sort of technical education. I mean, it's a very long way to go. I can't stress enough how this first consultation on sort of the direction of travel is really only a first step. And obviously getting the response to the consultation will help us shape which bits get taken forward and how, and then that next level of detail that we'll need to consult on in more detail and next year.
Yeah, just to say thank you for everyone who's taken the time to put a comment in the chat. And I know that we haven't been able to come to all of them, but we will have a copy of the chat, and so I think we'll work through that in the morning. And I think there's lots of tremendously valuable points being raised, so really appreciate it. And please don't feel disheartened if we haven't had a chance to come to you this evening.
No, and thank you both for your time and being so open and candid about the thinking and the insights. So it just boils for me to say huge thanks to Sarah and Lawrence for taking everyone through that. I hope you've all found that really helpful. I think, as we've seen in the questions in the chat, there's a huge amount of interest and conversation still to be had on this. We will certainly do our best to look at those questions and think about how do we sort of respond back to that, because we are very keen, as we've tried to iterate through the whole conversation this afternoon, this really is a consultation, and we really do want to hear your views and opinions. Just a reminder, the consultation closed on the 7th of October, so next week. So there is still time for you to put responses in. We really are interested in hearing your views. We will probably think about maybe running a post-consultation webinar to maybe sort of go through some of the responses that we've had, maybe give us an opportunity to have another conversation on some of the responses and maybe some of the big questions that we'll be wrestling with. I think as Sarah and Lawrence have said very helpfully, we'll be having to do sort of further consultation on this as we go forward. It's really important that we want to build this in an open and transparent way. As Sarah said many times, there's some really important trade-off questions for us together in terms of what we do on certain things. So there are some trade-offs, and so it's really important that I think we are very clear about those, and we have as I said, have a rich conversation and bring as many views in on all of that. So it just forces me to finish by saying thank you so much for everyone for spending your time. It would not be obviously a webinar without me saying a huge thank you to everything that you do. You really do make the system what it is. I hope that you take some confidence from the session today on the intent of what we're trying to achieve through this work and the way that we're going about it. We really do want to approach this in very much about trying to sort of support you in continuing to do the great things that you already do. So thank you so much for everything you do. It really does make a difference. You really do change people's lives through the work that you do. So thank you from all of us in the team to you. And we are looking forward to working with you all as we develop this thinking and as we go forward. So on that note, I'm going to say a huge thank you and goodbye.